How to nourish cities through conscious food production and circularity. Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, architecture, cities and many more. I am extremely happy to welcome you in the fourth season of Urbcast, my podcast that I created out of curiosity for cities, for architecture, for design around us. And I am extremely happy that this is the third year that I can realize my big passion of meeting people, of talking to them, of learning from them, and discussing the topics that are important or should be important if it comes to our cities and how do we design those. This podcast is directed not only to designers, architects, or students of those, but also to citizens. If you live in a city or in an urban area, this podcast is something for you. Let me start by saying that I do realize the climate crisis that we are witnessing currently, and this will definitely be one of the biggest challenges for us as a society. And this gonna be one of the key topics, one of the key backgrounds for the stories covered this year in the podcast. We will start by talking about food production in our cities and how can we use the term of circularity to be more resource conscious. My first guest of the fourth season of the podcast is Enlai Hooi, who is the head of innovation at Schmidt Hammer Lassen Architects, which is an international architecture firm founded by a group of Danish architects back in 1986 in Aarhus, and it is currently having 3 offices, one in Copenhagen, one in Aarhus, as well as one in Shanghai. Today, we're gonna focus on the innovation, sustainability, and we will discuss Enlai's and Schmidt Hammer Lassen's willingness to co-create solutions for building industry with a range of architecture, engineering, and construction, but focusing on circular economy principles and material cycles. The key themes for the episode will be conscious food production and its relation to our cities, and also circularity as a tool for developing our cities in a better way. So welcome to our conversation with Enlai and to the newest and the first episode of this season. Welcome, Enlai. Thank you for joining.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
I'm happy that you are enriching the Urbcast program, the Urbcast agenda, discussing about cities and discussing about how can we make our cities a bit better places to live. We are both based in Copenhagen, and this is a city that is truly inspiring.
I feel like Copenhagen is a really nicely developed city with a lot of potential. When you're a design practitioner, I don't think that there's any place that will fully satisfy you.
Constant search.
It is a constant search, yeah. Like in many ways, being a designer requires you to be in a constant state of dissatisfaction. Because if you didn't have some sort of intellectual dissatisfaction, you wouldn't be thinking about how to improve things.
This is a podcast about urbanism, about cities, architecture. We are both kind of within the industry. And that's why I wanted to ask you about, do you have any thoughts about like how can we designers, the ones that at the end draw the spaces, the urban spaces, the buildings, how can we bring real, I don't want to use, maybe I should use the word sustainable approach, but sustainability as a word nowadays has also a lot of connotations.
Sure.
But how to design in a way that we don't harm the earth, because I remember it clearly when he once said that earth will be fine without us.
Yes. The quote came from George Carlin, who's a comedian, where you have all of these people saying, oh, save the earth. And George was saying, well, the earth will be fine. It's ourselves. We're the ones that are fucked, you know. It's smart because, you know, the earth has been through extraordinary, like, temperature changes and, you know, proportion of CO2 in the atmosphere has been higher than it is projected in 2050. It's just been a place that's been uninhabitable for human beings. Like, if we were in any of these parts of Earth's history, we wouldn't really survive. So the Earth goes through these cycles. They've all been sort of natural cycles until we've come along. And we've sort of broken the sort of charm of the Holocene, which has happened in the last 10,000 or so years, which has been like highly predictable, stable conditions, which are underpinned by, you know, not just biodiversity, but biodensity as well. Like, so we can't survive on a Noah's Ark sort of framework where as long as we have two of each animal, we'll be fine. Do you know what I mean? It's all about the services that these animals, plants, fungi, etc., produce for us that allows the Holocene to exist. Weather is not disconnected from life. Weather is created by life. So when we lose this biodensity and we lose this biodiversity, we lose the ability for the weather system to remain stable. And I think a lot of people are losing sight of that we're doing in the food production system that we have. We have doing terrible things for the nitrification of the oceans and the agrogeochemical cycles. We're doing really bad things for sort of genetic diversity when we grow food in fields and we only have single crops, and how we use pesticides and mine for those and create toxins in our seas. And actually, it's our oceans that are the biggest biological and material buffer between us and climate change. And our oceans are the worst kept because they're the least, you know, territorially manageable space by humans. We're land-dwelling animals, and so we don't have a method of dealing with the ocean's stewardship in the way that we should. And so, I mean, maybe folding back to your original question, is like, how do we design for in any one place urbanistically?
Maybe first step is like how to appreciate the earth, understand the importance, right? Before we just take the pen and...
Well, that's it. In a way, that's the secret sauce, right? The more we understand about these interconnected systems, the better we can, you know, mark our place within that. And as designers, we're just not educated as ecologists. In order to be a good urbanist, in order to be a good building designer, what we should be doing is understanding the connections between things and not be educated where everything that we produce is a kind of object. And so what we, at Schmidt Hammer Lassen, what we're always talking about now is that the study of ecology is not the study of nature. It's actually the study of the connections between things. And in order to understand architecture in that way, it comes the realization that architecture is the craft of the invisible. Like all of these things, like human relationships, supporting biodiversity, material and energy flows, resources, waste, food, behaviors of communality, they're all these invisible forces. And we're not taught to deal with them properly or understand them or analyze them in nearly as complex way as they should be understood.
Have you heard about a book called Citopia?
Yes.
One of my favorite books ever.
Yes.
By Caroline Steele, the British architect. And actually, she advocates for us realizing that cities were created on food proximity, and that it was always like that the cities were created because of food proximity, because of food being just around the corner. And what we did for the last decades, or probably even more, is that we were just cutting the chain, like shortening it and trying to maximize the food production, right? In a way that we are just very good at like exploiting the farms and the land and the animals around us, just to push everything into the city, consume that, produce some waste, and that's it.
You know, it's extraordinary that you mention this, because one of our major focuses in the office right now is how to reverse that trend and how to reevaluate what nutrients means in the inner city context as well. It's amazing that you like that, because our partners, Perkins & Will in Vancouver, they're really focused on food and nutrient circularity. And we are, in this office, really focused on food and nutrient circularity as well. We're going to start, actually, at the end of this year, we're going to start building a food system in our basement, food production system.
Okay. Wow.
And greenhouses and stuff, because that's our focus. That's one of our focuses that most architecture firms have forgotten about completely. And you know, to go back to your sort of proposition about how cities were created, well, the most interesting thing is that most cities that are fairly old cities, where the best agricultural land was, it's usually the mouth of a river, where it meets the sea, very fertile soil, because that's where the river dumps its nutrients. And so you've got the best land for farming, and that's where the concentration of people started. And then as we grow and grow and grow as a city, we're actually taking away the best farming land and we're building asphalt and concrete and putting cars on it and stuff like that. And that's like in a natural growth cycle of cities. But the real problem starts where we don't seek to fulfill our nutrient needs from around the city, but we start to look at, global commodity prices of, bananas grown in the Dominican Republic and rice grown in Australia or, corn grown in the USA in order to find the lowest price. And this is problematic because you've got a situation where what I believe we like as human beings is novelty and diversity and taste and nutrition and all of these things that mean something to us. And what supermarket systems are trying to do is buy the thing at the right size, weight, shape, and color from the cheapest location on the earth. And in order to reduce waste as a supermarket system, what they want to do is try and limit the options that we have in order to buy what we need. So there's not 12,000 types of corn. There's 2 types of corn, and one of them is genetically modified. And supermarkets would say that if you want to reduce waste, you limit choice so that the amount of stuff that we offer to you, you choose some of it and less gets thrown away. But if you could imagine a system where if you as a human being wanted more interest and more taste value and more nutrition, then you ask the person who's growing it, who's living next to you, to supply that. That means that you'll get this natural diversity occurring where the demands of that particular local area and those culture and food habits and those needs and tastes would create variations just, nearby, very locally to where it's being asked for. And if you're the grower yourself, then you're the one that, is creating your own demand. You're creating your own needs. And so instead of the supermarket saying, do you want it? If not, we throw it away. And there's always a proportion of waste.
A big one.
A huge one. And instead, what if you just grow the stuff that you like, or your friend grows what you like, and you harvest it when you need it? This can't supply everything that a city needs in terms of calories, but we should be looking past calories and into nutrients and taste and flavor. And that's where we should be working, I think. And to balance that, on the other opposite side, you've got buildings where only 2% of the nutrients that come into the building get used productively. 98% of those nutrients get, dumped as food waste or leave down our sewers or get, literally just thrown away and have to be dealt with a municipal system. And none of the value that comes from those nutrients are actually reinvested into farming or food production, which, some municipalities are better at, creating biogas and then using the rest on farms. But there's so much more that we could do with what we waste on site. And that's why, for me, production of food in the city is not just about creating diversity and interest and, all of these variations that, can create resilience, but also the idea that we'll start to treat our nutrients as something valuable. And if we can't use it ourselves, maybe the market gardener at the edge of town can use it. And this is not a crazy thing because like a guy named Paul Klærdal from Copenhagen just wrote a book called 500 Years of Urban Farming in Denmark. And this was always the case that, nutrients were treated in the medieval times as being quite valuable and used for food production. So why not now when we've got health technologies that are just way beyond what we had in the medieval times?
I will have a question about the book recommendation. Let's leave it as a last question for this discussion. But this is already a very good book to mention. And 500 years of urban farming.
Yeah, in Denmark.
Denmark. And the second one from my side would be Citopia. But let's come to that at the end of the conversation. And don't even start me on the food waste, because there's actually a very, very, very interesting person who is taking care of popularizing the fact that supermarkets in Denmark waste more than 30% of all the food. And he's called Matt Homut. He was also a guest of this podcast, and you can find him under Urban Harvester.
Right.
on Instagram.
Right.
He's showing the insane amounts of food that is being wasted by the supermarkets. And he just took some photos of the huge containers, the bins.
When we do our forum on this, we'll have to get him in as a speaker in that forum. Yeah,
definitely. I would really recommend talking to Matt because he really shows the stupidity of how we waste our extremely important resource, which is the food. And I'm happy that we kind of diverted into this topic because I think that what I would also like to bring to my listeners of this podcast is this kind of a food awareness, but not in a way that maybe, a hamburger from McDonald's is not that good and an apple is better, but this kind of food consciousness in a way of like how the food lands on our plate, what does it take to produce that food, and where is the food coming from? Because this is something, until I read this book of Karen Steele, I've never even thought, okay, this meal that I'm eating tonight, where is it even coming from? What was the whole cycle of that coming to my plate?
Right. There's a lack of trust as well. Like, when people start to ask those questions and they start to see, documentaries or warning labels on food saying, this might contain mercury or, like nickel or stuff like in the food labels. That's where this sort of like question is, okay, Denmark, very, very rich society, but with very little control over what goes in people's bodies. Like that's a real bit of a mindfuck, actually. You know what I mean? Like and America is the same. Like USA is one of the richest countries in the world per capita, and yet they have very little control over what goes in their bodies, except for maybe the Pacific Northwest. But there is this like almost cognitive dissonance between advanced countries that have a lot of control over the rest of their lives and very little control over what they're actually eating. That's a problem.
You've also mentioned like growing food inside the cities. So maybe to start, how to do it, because in a way, Copenhagen is a dense city. It's pretty dense. I can't think of enough space for growing food in a city. How is that even possible?
Interestingly, like the places that we draw reference from when we're doing our research in food happen to be the most densely populated cities with the highest, square meter price in the world.
Singapore,
yeah, Hong Kong, London, Paris, and we're talking about inner city Paris. All of these places, Tokyo as well, and Osaka. There are all of these places that are growing food, New York, who are growing food very effectively and even business-wise pretty good in the most expensive square meter places in the world, in very opportunistic places. So like Paris, for example, has this thing called the New Farm, which is the largest sort of urban farm in Europe. And it's like a flat and vertical farm above a shopping center. In Paris, there's in the London Underground, they're growing like microgreens, but also mushrooms and various other things. Of course, there's different types of vegetables or things that you can grow that match different environmental circumstances. So if you were going to grow potatoes or corn or wheat, it wouldn't be a financially beneficial exercise to do that in the center of the city. But when we want to create a more sort of vitamins and nutrition and stuff like that, some of it can be gotten from corn and wheat, but we're really after these sort of high value ingredients that have a high nutritious value as well. Like, mushrooms and greens and, maybe some sort of vines like tomatoes and stuff like that. And that can be grown in the city. And then the question is, what are the areas of the city that are uncontested? Like Denmark has loads of them. London has loads of them. It's all of these. Every time you go in to adaptively transform a tower, there's probably, you can see this in London, Tokyo, Trondheim, all sorts of places where when you're inheriting buildings for transformation or when things change, and this could be car parking bases, it could be like second level underground, all of this sort of stuff. You're often inheriting spaces that become dead, that have no functional purpose. Right under this office, we have this huge underground area where up on the floors 1 and 2, you can't fit another desk in. We're scratching for space, but under there's loads of space, completely uncontested. And that happens all over the city. So it's not really a question of, is there space in these cities? It's more or less, how do you unlock those spaces?
And how you do that, because like it's easier said than done. That's something that you might also experience while designing, right? So you first have this vision, and then you sketch, and then you think, okay, that's going to be pretty nice. And then you start drawing it, you start measuring that, and then you say, okay, it's not looking as I really thought about it, that it can look.
Right.
So would you have something to share about that? And I know it for a fact that there are also some designers listening to us, so maybe it could have some kind of a form of a recommendation as well, like how to design those in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because often when you're an architect, there's many layers of information between you and decision making, right? When you go into a schematic design, anything's possible. When you drive down to design development, or when value engineering comes, all of these sorts of things, a lot of things get sort of stripped away.
Yeah.
And so the problem is that what architects are very bad at doing is analyzing and supporting a business case for the things that they're doing. Because in a way, at school, we're not taught how to make a business case. It's not even our job, just take space and make it beautiful. It's more or less the dumbest version of what we've been taught to do.
Make some nice visualization.
Yeah, make some nice, make sure that the brand is good. I mean, it's more complex than that. Like, of course, architecture is difficult and multifaceted, but we're not really trained as entrepreneurs. And so substantiating things that are novel, and that's not just to do with food growing, it can be anything that is, not done in a building, can be very, very difficult for us as a profession to support and substantiate. Novelty and innovation are hard, And so the idea of working out what are the parameters of success is extremely important in our industry, and something that we're not very good at. And so then where I found like the best outcomes is where you are good at identifying, sub-suppliers, contractors, technologists, companies that have gone through this process once or twice before and can work with you in that design. You can't just sort of think it out, draw it up, and expect it to work. That's tough because, how do you do that with no deep experience in the industry? How do you know that you can only really get a rooftop to work on an industrial scale if you've got a lift that goes up to the top or that can support the weight? How do you know that logistics of, moving things in and out of the building are going to be the most important thing without having any experience of that? So I think the idea of identifying your research as an architect is just as much about what partner can solve that problem and who they are. Can they see along your line of vision? And can you create a sort of like a robust business case around certain things before you even draw it up? And that's not something that we're used to doing as architects. We're used to being able to think, well, hand of God, here we go. We draw it, it becomes real, But when things have a high degree of novelty, and that's like with food and stuff like that, you need to almost start with the business case or find people who can start with that and tell you what the hierarchy of parameters are. We've got a partner called Nabo Farms that go in and actually they travel all around Europe, and they look at people who are trying to set things up and establish their management software and say, what's your yield and how does that work in with prices and stuff like that. So it's almost like management consulting for micro food growing situations. And that's the sort of thing you might need if it is a business case. But then there's the other case where just the fact that it's there and it's growing is a value into itself. So it doesn't have to make money out of, per kilo of greens produced or, whatever. And that's where there's a situation where the identity created out of the activity, not just the identity, but the participation and the ability to have, people in a community get together and do stuff together, that can be very valuable. And that can be much more valuable than the cost, the cost of the salad that you end up producing. Maybe that's free. It doesn't really matter. And the reason why I'm saying this is because, like, in our cities, we have a situation where free time is valuable, but too much free time becomes a problem. You know what I mean? Like, if you're not otherwise engaged and you're lonely or you have too little going on in your social life, then you become a problem for other people who just want to see you in small proportions or whatever. And we're living nearby people who have that problem in our space, and there's no solution for that. There's no way of them contributing to the community in a way that gives them status, benefits, etc. But when you have something which is productive, and it doesn't have to be food, it could be like, a bike repair workshop, it could be anything that sort of benefits the group as a whole, then there's value for time. I think food is one of the most interesting ways of doing it because it innately ties in with, nobody will refuse nice vegetables or greens, if they come to your door. People are going to value the people that spend time on those things. Food is an innate part of culture. So if you've got a diverse group of people that have to start living together and like each other, food is a perfect conduit for that. So there's so many, and when you're, say, for example, have a development, if you're a developer and you've got a plot where, 9 out of 10 plots that are being developed around the city are just like yours, then how can you distinguish yourself? How can you say, well, this creates an identity, or this pre-selects people who find something new which is valuable that they can't find elsewhere? Those things, food is amazing for that because there's always a way in which it can be tuned to a culture. It's not like if you put a swimming pool and you find that actually people don't really use it and they don't care, and it's an expense. People will always find a way to make food, work for them in the way that they want, as long as the system is put in a way that's flexible and participatory enough.
I'm glad you're mentioning the business case of that, because actually recently one of my guests was someone working with a real estate developer at Enlai. So like the biggest Scandinavian developer basically. And I was really interested about the real estate kind of role to be played within urban development. And as you said, it's a very, very important, almost like key, like vital component in developing our ideas, developing the cities, but also like developing the food production. A business case has to be there. But to kind of close the loop, I would like to add last component, which will be about closing the loop, because I'm wondering how could we integrate in all of that has been just said, circularity. So basically all the things that we discuss that are being produced, whether it is the food or we should be talking about the circular buildings as well, right? So in a way that we don't waste all the resources. And I know that circularity is a topic that you have a big knowledge of. How could we integrate circularity, whether in our design work as designers, urbanists, and so on, but also maybe in our life as citizens, as human beings?
Yeah, circularity is interesting a topic because it's so broad that you could spend 3 hours talking about just that. So it's a hard thing to wrap up, with just that term. There are two sort of factors of circularity that are conceptually really important. Number one is that waste as a term should not exist. So everything becomes a nutrient for something else, right? And architects and designers in the building industry have been struggling and sometimes quite successful in focusing on and looking at how materials become circular or how components become circular. So you have companies out there now that are not just saying, oh, let's take our glass and recycle it, or let's, take a door and store it here and move it over there, or, take bricks and clean them and use them again. This is kind of like a base level material circularity. But if you think about circularity, and it's the second concept of circularity, and perhaps the most important concept of circularity, is not just that materials get reused or recycled or upcycled, but that you try and keep things at their highest form of complexity before you break it up and before you start to try and recycle those things. So a column is best when it's recycled or when it's reused as a column. A door is best as a door. So you put energy into taking the metal parts off and recycling those, and taking the glass and crushing it and taking out the laminating film and recycling that. And so you put energy in terms of recycling. So that's the last thing you should do in circularity, is actually recycle. The first thing you should do is kind of manage what you have better. And the first step after that, the most important thing to do is to reuse what you have, to be as creative as possible about your use of space or about the use of objects, components, etc. So if we talk about that in terms of like the city, the first thing that we should be doing in the city is not thinking about how wood can be circular or how concrete can be circular or glass can be circular or whatever, where you harvest materials and stuff like that. It's very important. But the first thing you should be doing is saying, if this building is becoming empty, can we first change the function of the building? Can we not demolish or even deconstruct, but can we do surgery to that building to make it a different typology or a different function? And in our office, we call that adaptive transformation, because it's not just about renovating, it's about transforming the function by adapting. And I think that's a really sort of important thing to understand, that circularity starts with the creative adaptation of what you already have, right? That's the creative job of an architect, then stops becoming what do you imagine from a tabula rasa. The creative job of an architect is imagining what an existing situation could be leveraged into, what it could become. And not just what it could become once, but what could it become first time, second time, third time, as it changes according to the needs of the users. So for me, adaptive transformation is a much higher level of circularity in architecture and in cities than, say, for example, material reuse and recycling, even though they are also extremely important, because sometimes you can't do that. But there's not enough focus on adaptive transformation. Then the second thing about circularity is actually, in a way, the circularity is not just about buildings as an object and the end of life. It's about how the object uses and consumes not just energy and water, but also food, nutrients, the wastewater and the heat from that, all of those sorts of things. So what we've been focused on in the building industry is, all the certifications are based on this. It's like, how much energy do we use for heating? How much energy do we use for lighting? How much water do we use? But my question really is, how much water do we reuse? How much food do we turn in, or food waste or human waste do we turn into nutrients? How much, energy do we keep from being used in the first place by just creating passive systems that use other processes, so that we're not trying to keep the outside out, nature bad, inside good, but we're actually trying to use nature to create the conditions that we want and be soft about that transition. And actually many certifications work directly against that perspective. And so when we talk about like food waste, the first part of circularity is not to waste the food. And the second part is, if you've finished using the food, what can be done with that is positive? And that's where food growing comes into it. And that's when water use comes into it. Because if you're a meat eating, let's say there's an office or a residential tower and people eat food and waste food, then that's going to be probably the number one waste fraction in terms of volume. That was a study in Milan that really looked at that. Number one waste fraction in terms of volume. But then if you think about how much water you use in the shower or the kitchen, the amount of water that's wasted when you waste food is many times that. So in the most likely, if you talk about all of the scopes 1, 2, and 3, the most likely biggest single water use in any occupied building is food waste. The largest physical fraction is probably food waste. And the second largest CO2 fraction is food waste. And yet the building industry has none of that in its scope, and none of the certifications seek to measure that. So I think that we as a building industry have to stop drawing a box around the building as a separate entity, as if the people in the building didn't matter, and start looking at the behavior of people in buildings and what waste they produce in order to get a full picture of how cities perform. And so then, food waste, energy use through plug load behaviors, the way we take a shower, the way we behave, these things are not really tackled properly in architecture.
Okay, definitely circularity is a very broad topic, and then we could spend another podcast episode or two talking about it, only about circularity within the industry, but also outside. But who knows, maybe that gives us a chance to meet again in the future and record another episode on specifically about that. But for now, to wrap it up, as I mentioned before, I would love to ask you for a book recommendation. We already mentioned 2 books that I can always add into the episode description, add the link to it. Would you have anything else to recommend to the listeners?
I mean, if you want something that's a bit more literary.
My requirement would be that it could be more or less connected to the topic of our discussion.
Yes. I think The Overstory, I think the author's name is Richard Powers, is a really interesting book. Insofar as it's not an analysis, it's not nonfiction like Cytopia or Hungry City or 500 years of urban farming in Denmark, but it does maybe make us sensitive to the deeper connection between us and nature. And it's a gorgeously written book. It's like just amazing. So The Overstory is worth a read.
Thank you for that recommendation, Enlai. And thank you for sharing all your expertise and knowledge with me and the listeners of this podcast. I'm happy that we really touched upon the topic of food.
Well, I mean, thank you very much. And I mean, maybe in the next podcast, it would be cool to hear your thoughts about all of these things. We got some of them in there. I know I talk a lot, but it would be really nice to have you present and I could do the interviewing maybe.
Definitely. We can just change the roles. Switch the roles for the next time. I'm up for that. Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast. I hope that it was a very practical and useful episode to listen. If you would like to get something more about the topic, feel free to reach out to my guest, as well as visit Urbcast's website at urbcast.pl or follow Urbcast on social media. I'm present on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Talk to you in 2 weeks.